Welcome to ICU Primary Prepcast.
Hi, I'm Maddie.
Hi, I'm Swapnil, and we both are very privileged to join by our third celebrity guest, that is Dr. Mike Clifford from Melbourne. So welcome, Mike.
Yeah, I'm the celebrity. Get me out of here.
Well, there is a lot of feedback and requests from a lot of candidates to keep Mike Clifford going, and they would like to see Mike keep answering Maddie's jokes from this episode onwards. So you're not going anywhere, Mike. Okay, so today we are going to continue the same pattern that Mike suggested, that how to prepare for ICU primary exams at the bedside. And the patient that we are going to discuss today is the neuro ICU patient that most of you will see in the major tertiary care centers. So the scenario I'm going to give to all of us, and then we will pick up one question each. It's a 32-year-old gentleman who had a motor vehicle accident and admitted to intensive care unit with severe traumatic brain injury with a baseline GCS of 6. So Mike and Maddie, you are on the ward round. So who wants to go first?
I'll go first, Maddie. I can see that this bloke's got an EVD insertion there, and we can see he's obviously got CSF draining through there. Tell me about CSF production.
So CSF is the fluid that bathes the brain and the spinal cord. It's formed mainly by the choroid plexus, which is a rich network of blood vessels that project into the ventricles. And the choroid plexus is made of a very specialised cuboidal epithelium that's continuous with the ependymal cells that line the ventricles. So these epithelial cells of the choroid plexus are interconnected via tight junctions, and this helps create a blood CSF barrier. So most of the CSF is formed by this choroid plexus, but the remaining about 20 to 30% is formed directly from the walls of the ventricle. CSF is mainly produced, firstly, by selective ultrafiltration of the plasma through these fenestrated capillaries of the choroid plexus, and the second mechanism is by active secretion. So the active secretion is mainly sodium, which is transported by active chloride, and which is transported by active transport, and chloride, which is also transported with sodium due to the electrical chemical gradient that's generated. Along with these ions, water is transmitted via osmosis, which balances this osmotic gradient. Some other substances like bicarbonate can enter via ion channels or via conversion from carbon dioxide and water under the influence of carbonic anhydrase. And CSF formation is relatively constant within normal CSF pressures.
So how much CSF is made in a day?
Usually about 500 to 600 mils are made a day. So this works out to about 20 to 25 mils an hour. But within the brain and the spinal canal, there's only about 150 mils, which means that there needs to be a very regular turnover of CSF about 3 to 4 times a day.
Yeah, very good. Okay. And where does that, you've mentioned where it gets made. Where does it go? What's the circulation of CSF?
So CSF flows in one direction. It's initially secreted into the lateral ventricles and passes into the third ventricle via the foramen of Monro. A small amount of fluid is then added. It then flows down the aqueduct of Sylvius into the fourth ventricle, and then passes out of the fourth ventricle through either the foramen of Magendie, which is medial, or M for medial, which goes to the spinal subarachnoid space, or there's 2 foramina of Luschka, 2 which are lateral, so L for Luschka, which goes into the subarachnoid space overlying the cerebral cortex. Most of the CSF is then absorbed by arachnoid villi along mainly the superior sagittal sinus and the transverse sinus into the bloodstream. But more and more, we're realising that some of this CSF can also be absorbed through the cribriform plate into the lymphatic channels and through fake lymphatic system of the brain. I think it's the glymphatic system. And absorption occurs due to a pressure gradient where the CSF pressure is higher than the venous pressure within these sinuses.
Yeah, very good. Okay, so we're letting that fluid out. Why have we decided to do that in this patient with his sort of swollen brain? What are we trying to protect him from?
So I think this leads on to something called the Monro-Kelly doctrine, where it states that the skull is a rigid box. The sum of volumes of the constituents within the skull, which is the brain, which makes up the majority of 80 to 85%, the CSF that we've just talked about, which is up to 10%, and then the cerebral blood volume is constant. So any increase in the pressure or the amount of one part of these constituents needs to be compensated for by one of the other constituents. So for ICP to remain normal, an increase in volume of, say, in this case, the brain or the blood volume needs to be compensated by, in this case, the CSF. And the way we can do this in someone with an EBD is to try and drain some of this CSF from the EBD. Although it's important to note that this can only be done to a certain extent, and that after which the ICP will continue to rise and impact on a cerebral perfusion pressure.
Yeah, that's very good. Well done.
Great. So now it's my turn, Mike. So you are my registrar, my ward round. So the question, Mike, now is, as Maddie mentioned, within the Monro-Kelly doctrine, there are 3 components. And so let's talk about the blood component of this Monro-Kelly doctrine. What is the normal cerebral blood flow and how this blood flow is regulated?
Yeah, good. Okay, so this is a fairly classic primary question for Aviva. And sometimes we'll ask people to write an SAQ on this, but there's a few little short numbers that people should remember. And then I'll tell you how I use the rule of 50 to try and remember all the rest. So you're looking at about 750 mils per minute for the average sort of 1,500 gram adult brain, which works out to be 15% of cardiac output. And it's about 20% of oxygen consumption per minute. So there's just a few little short facts. And if we think about it, the oxygen consumption is about 3 mils per 100 grams per minute. And the blood flow is a nice, easy 50 mils per 100 gram per minute. So when you see all of the cerebral blood flow curves where you're looking at the relationship of cerebral blood flow to blood pressure, oxygen or carbon dioxide, if you remember that the 100%, which is where it usually starts, you can tell yourself, well, that's 50, right? So once you know that the 100% of cerebral blood flow is 50 mils per 100 gram per minute, you can draw that line across, and then you can use the other 50s to help you tell something about all those other curves. That's the way I like to do it. So there's 4 curves of cerebral blood flow, and we know that cerebral blood flow is a function of the cerebral perfusion pressure divided by the cerebral vascular resistance. The cerebral vascular resistance, like all other blood systems or blood vascular systems, is regulated by metabolic regulation and largely chemical factors that stimulate vasodilation, be they potassium, adenosine, nitric oxide, whatever the local mediator is. The most important of those curves is actually the most boring. It's the linear curve that relates cerebral blood flow to metabolic rate, and it's just a straight line. And we can also use that curve to reflect temperature. And this is where this industry of cooling the brain comes from. We know that as you increase the temperature of the brain, for each 1 degree Celsius, you get about a 6% increase in metabolic rate, which increases the cerebral blood flow by about that level. So obviously, if the brain's hot, you cool it down to normal. Whether you continue to cool the brain further than that to protect it is arguable, and increasingly the trials would suggest that it's not particularly helpful, but be that as it may, that's what the curve shows. And the other 3 curves of importance, the first of all is the relationship of cerebral blood flow to mean arterial pressure. And that's a lovely curve that has a linear rising component and then a plateau phase and then another rise at the end. And if you remember, we said 50, and the number you use for that flat part of the curve is between 50 or 60 millimeters of mercury up to 150 to 160 millimeters of mercury. I tell people to remember 50 because then you know that 50 mils per 100 gram per minute equals 50 to 150 millimeters of mercury on that curve. So you make it easy to remember for yourself. And you just remember that over that middle section of the curve, the middle section of mean arterial blood pressure, brain blood flow is protected. So as your blood pressure lowers, you get cerebral vasodilation. And as blood pressure goes up, you get cerebral vasoconstriction, so that there is a fairly standard and linear blood flow through the normal parts of the brain. The 2 other curves are the relationship of cerebral blood flow to the partial pressure of oxygen. And we know that for the majority of an elevated PO2, there is no change to cerebral blood flow. And then once you reach about 60 millimeters of mercury, or you can tell yourself, I'm going to remember about 50 millimeters of mercury, that curve starts to rapidly rise away from 50 mils per 100 gram per minute and goes and asymptotes towards infinity. So there's a rapid takeoff. So once you become hypoxic and your PaO2 falls below 60 and definitely 50, you get a massive rise in cerebral blood flow to try and protect the brain. Now, the last curve, the really sexy curve, is the relationship of carbon dioxide to cerebral blood flow. And it's a linear curve, very similar to the temperature curve over the majority of the range. And it has 2 flattened areas. And the flattened area is about 20 millimeters of mercury CO2. And then up at the other end at about 80 millimeters of mercury, the curve tails off. But in that central section, for every 1 millimeter of mercury of CO2 rise, you get about 4% increase in cerebral blood flow. So that's that linear component of the curve. CO2 goes up, cerebral blood flow goes up. When you get up to the upper part, the 80 part, what tends to happen is that you're maximally vasodilated. So you can't increase your blood flow anymore, even though your CO2 is going up. And what limits you at that point is probably your cardiac output. You just can't push more blood flow through those pipes. You're limited. At the lower part of the curve, as you start to further cause cerebral vasoconstriction, what tends to stop the curve from getting any further down is that your brain starts to become hypoxic. So local metabolic factors cause vasodilation so that you can't continue to lower cerebral blood flow by reducing CO2 further. So there's a little tail. Curiously enough, if you put a patient in a hyperbaric chamber and you massively increase their oxygen so you don't get that hypoxemic component, that lower part of the CO2 curve actually continues in a linear fashion, goes all the way down to baseline. So that's a function of being in a normal atmosphere. So that's cerebral blood flow and its regulation. And those are the 4 curves of cerebral blood flow that we would often ask a candidate to draw or interpret. And we might ask, well, what might happen if they were hypertensive, or what might happen if they were a little old lady or a tiny little baby? And usually the curves remain pretty much the same, with the exception of the autoregulation related to blood pressure, which tends to shift in the direction consistent with your physiology. But they're lovely curves to talk about, and they're great fun to examine.
Yeah, I got asked that in my primary Viva to label those curves.
Did you? Excellent.
Yep.
Thanks,
Music
Mike.
to my ears.
So I guess continuing on this trend of looking at this patient with a traumatic brain injury, and he's got an EVD in situ, we see that one of the monitors or the waveforms that we look at on the monitor is the ICP waveform. Swapnil, can you tell us a bit about what the components are of the ICP waveform?
Yeah, so before we go on to the actual waveform, I really want to take a step back and actually talk about what are the different types of ICP monitoring, because that again can be asked in the exam scenario. So I like to divide them into invasive monitoring, minimally invasive monitoring, and non-invasive monitoring. So what we're talking about here is EVD, which is probably the part of like the invasive monitoring. So within the invasive monitoring, there could be, again, 2 different types of monitoring that we normally use. One is the fluid-filled catheter system, that is the EVD, external ventricular drain, or it could be the implantable sensors such as Codman's, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But let's talk about the EVD monitoring, because this patient has got a EVD monitoring. So it's basically a fluid-filled catheter system, and it measures the global pressure because the tip of the catheter is in the CSF. And as we talked about in the Monro-Kelly doctrine, it kind of measures the pressure within the CSF, which will be affected by increase in pressure within either parenchyma or because of the increased cerebral blood flow. Usually it's zeroed at foramen of Monro, which is the level of the tragus, and that's where we like to zero our transducer. And the advantages of using the EVD over other sensors is basically, first of all, is considered to be the most accurate mode of measurement of ICP. The second one is it can be used both as a therapeutic and diagnostic purposes. So if the ICP goes up, we can open the EVD and drain the fluid, and that can be therapeutic. But also we can send some CSF to diagnose whether the patient has got any other complications such as infection. Now, the limitations of EVD is, first of all, it's invasive. It obviously can lead to other complications such as bleeding or infection. It is obviously based on zeroing at the level of tragus, which can be sometimes inaccurate. Also, it could be inaccurate because if the fluid-filled system is filled with other things other than CSF, such as blood or debris, then obviously that reading will not be accurate. And also the distance between the transducer and ventricle can be sometimes quite long with the use of long tubing, and that might obviously interfere or give rise to some of the errors in ICP monitoring. Now, coming back to your question about the waveform. So normally there are 2 types of ICP measurements that we get from this EVD. One is a static ICP measurement, which is nothing but the mean ICP, which is actually the absolute value of the pressure in regards to the reference value or in regards to the 0 point. And normally what is displayed on the monitor is usually the mean ICP level in millimeters of mercury. When you look at the pulsatile ICP monitoring and the waveform, then usually we see 3 different waves. namely P1, P2, and P3. And it's slightly different to the arterial pressure waveform where we see normally 2 peaks, while in ICP monitoring, we see 3 peaks or 3 waves. The P1 is called as percussion wave, is due to the arterial pulsations. The P2 is called as tidal wave. And basically, this wave is probably most important because it correlates with the brain tissue compliance. And the third wave is the P3 wave, which is associated with the closure of the aortic valve and is also called as dicrotic wave. In a normal adult brain, when we see P1 is always going to be more than P2, while in abnormal scenarios such as this patient with the TBI with a raised ICP, the P2 will be higher than P1, which basically suggests that there is a problem with tissue compliance of the brain of this patient. Now, coming back to other invasive, sometimes if EVD is not available or people might prefer using the second ICP monitoring, which also called as ICP sensors. And there are 3 different types. One is if they use the fiber optic tips, then that's called as Camino. If it's a strain gauge principle that we normally use in ICU, it's a Codman's ICP monitoring. And the third one uses the pneumatic or way of monitoring the ICP. Now, the advantages with the Codman or any ICP sensors is slightly less invasive than EVD. And it's the 0 point is in reference to atmospheric. And that can be the advantage or that can be disadvantage because these systems cannot be re-zeroed. So that means these systems lead to drifting of the reading over the period of time and you cannot adjust. So compared to Codman and EVD, initially you still get accurate readings, but over the period of time, you might drift. The second biggest disadvantage with the Codman is it's inserted predominantly in the frontal region of the brain. And that means it's measuring the pressure in one particular region of the brain, parenchyma, and it does not probably reflect the global pressures within the brain. And also Codman's or these ICP sensors cannot be used for the therapeutic purposes, such as draining the CSF if the ICP readings are high. So that's different invasive monitorings. Now, coming to the waveform that I forgot to mention, but there are other waves classified they are called as Lundberg's waves. They are the low frequency fluctuation in the static mean ICPs. And they are classified again into A, B, and C waves. Usually they're associated with the high ICPs or abnormal ICPs. So A wave they're also called as plateau waves or vasogenic waves, and usually seen with the ICP of more than 50 millimeters of mercury. B waves are, again, they're a short duration, usually 0.5 to 2 waves per minute, and usually associated with ICP around 30 to 50. And then C waves are usually with slightly more frequency, 4 to 8 waves per minute, and can be seen up to ICP of 30 millimeters of mercury. So these are different to P1, P2, P3 waves that are associated with the pulsatile ICP monitoring, while these A, B, C waves are more associated with the static ICP. Just to finish the other component about the ICP monitoring. So less invasive, you can measure the ICP with less invasive methods such as lumbar puncture or epidural ICP monitoring, which are not commonly used, while the non-invasive methods are not that uncommon. So most common non-invasive method that we use in our setup is probably CT imaging. And again, the trial did not show any difference between using the CT versus invasive ICP monitoring. The other non-invasive methods include transcranial Doppler, optic nerve sheath diameter measurement, OTIC method, which I learned today for the first time, where we look at the tympanic membrane response to stapedial reflex, because the cochlear duct is a connection between the CSF and ear. So we can actually measure via ear. And similarly, there is another method called as acoustic method, where we send a transcranial acoustic signal from one ear plug and measure the returning signal through the ear plug on the other side. And then that way we can monitor the ICP. So they are the non-invasive methods of ICP monitoring.
Well, you did a lot of homework this week.
And proof that you can send a signal through one ear to the other without actually transferring it through the brain. Is that right, Swapna?
Yeah, that's right. Because it also takes into account the skull component of the Monro-Kelly doctrine. So it also relies on the bony part. So obviously that's not going to be accurate when you are measuring in the patient with a decompressive craniectomy, I guess, but apparently it can be used. So I thought I need to give some competition to Mike because he was shining so much so far.
These are a starting point. So one of the beautiful things about doing if you have to go and study ICP and you've got to study how to monitor ACP and you've got to study EVDs and it's a transducer, well, you're basically just revising transducers because it's the same transducer. You use exactly the same system. You use the same method to zero, all of the same problems of measuring a JVP or a CVP or an art line are the same. And the only subtle difference is that you take as your zero level, your hydrostatic level, exactly as you said, the external aorta trunniatus or the circle of Willis, so that's where you measure your zero pressure point from. Particularly if you've got a patient sitting up at 45 degrees in the bed, you want to make sure that you're providing a mean arterial pressure to perfuse the brain. But all of those curves we talked about earlier, we would often use them in a primary to say, well, okay, so what happens to this blood pressure curve if I give this drug? Or what happens to this cerebral metabolic rate curve if I give a big dose of propofol? And all of these things are trying to relate the things that you're seeing at the bedside, like we are with this bloke. We're all staring around at the bed, looking at all these numbers and thinking, what does it all mean? And what are the principles behind them, so that we give the passion for our candidates as to why we desperately want to know this stuff, because it informs what we do every day. And the next step is, okay, well, now we're going to give some sedatives, and what's going to happen? What would we expect to happen to those things? Or what might we expect to see happen to the CSF if we give a big dose of mannitol, and why would that be? And if you're in my unit, then you'll get a long lecture about, well, where does mannitol come from and why is seaweed important? And we're off down another pathway. But it starts at the bedside. It starts with these fantastic numbers and these monitoring systems and the sick patient we're trying to look after. So that's where my passion for the primary comes from. And yeah, you go home and just like that Swapnil, you spend a day looking up stuff you wouldn't otherwise do. And now you can whip out an ultrasound on the ward round tomorrow and do an ultrasound of the optic disc and tell us what the ICP is. It's fantastic.
That's right. Actually, I'm well qualified in doing transcranial Dopplers. So yeah. Anyways, this is coming to the most exciting part for me now. That is the dad jokes component of this podcast. And today, Maddie has got one joke for Mike, and Mike has got one question for Maddie. So please go ahead.
All right, I'm first, Maddie. I'll take my turn privilege.
Okay.
So, okay, here we go. We're on the ward round. We've finished. We're going to walk to the tea room, and we've got to walk past the medication room or the Impress pharmacy on the ward round. But as we walk past, why did the intensivist tell the ICU team to be quiet when walking past the medication room?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know.
So they wouldn't wake the sleeping pills.
Yep, that's a good one. Definitely, that's a sleep deprived joke.
Maddie, let's see what you got for us.
Okay. I went on the brain theme. So why did the neuron get arrested?
Mike, you go ahead.
I'm trying to think about why he might be firing out of turn or something, but no, I can't get there, Maddie. You've got me.
Because he was charged with assault.
Oh! Excellent.
Right?
That's a good one, Maddie.
Very good. Oh, these are so bad. They're fantastic.
Yeah, it's my favorite.
Okay, the scores are 2-1 now, so in favor of Maddie. So let's continue this battle for the next time. So thanks, folks. Thanks for listening, and thanks, Mike and Maddie, for your valuable time. We'll be back in time with another similar pattern. Till then, stay safe and enjoy your time.
Yeah, please stay safe in Sydney, you guys. Look after yourselves.
Thank you. See you next time.